Hi, my name is Christopher Collins, and I'm here today to talk to you about this presentation, which is titled Using Nonfiction Books to Facilitate L2 English Acquisition, Peer Collaboration, and Content Learning. And this is for the Extensive Reading Around the World Conference 2021. So let's get started. First, I'd like to do a little bit of a presentation overview. So first, I do want to talk about the title because it's kind of a mouthful, I would say. And I want to unpack that just a little bit for you. And then I want to we'll focus on books and reading and intensive reading and extensive reading and kind of how I'm combining or conflating them in this activity that I'm introducing. And I'll give a little background context to my teaching, where I am in the world and so forth, who the students are, because I think that's important for this. And then I'll talk about what I call a kind of consolidated collaborative approach, which is a class reading project that blends intensive reading with extensive reading. And I do want to share some student feedback on their experience with this. So first of all, let's talk about this title. So it's using nonfiction books. So frankly, the fiction-nonfiction distinction isn't that meaningful necessarily. These things they're not necessarily, opposites. I guess the point that I'm trying to get at is a lot of reading material that is in book length form that's often used in language teaching context seems to me to be fiction. Sometimes I know in the context of extensive reading, it might be graded readers. All of that is great. There's no opposition from fiction from me, but I'm just talking about my own experience with using nonfiction, and I'll kind of clarify some examples of what I mean by that in this presentation. And the point is to facilitate second language acquisition. I think that's the name of the game with language teaching. It's what is it we can do to get those processes going from students that'll help them acquire the language. Peer collaboration. So I perceive an important part of this approach as being interactive, collaborative. This is a tenet of second language acquisition and language learning, interacting with others, using language, identifying your gaps in what you can express or understand. So I think that's important. And finally, perhaps a bonus of the sort, content learning through reading. It's such a great medium for learning things, as we know. So let me just step back and explain why reading, why did I submit a proposal? Why is this a topic that I care about as a teacher? So first of all, in teaching contexts, I find that there's an emphasis on productive language skills, so-called productive language skills, such as speaking and writing, as well as producing accurate grammatical form. I think this is just taken as fundamental in many contexts, but maybe this is the case because it's easier to assess and recognize when people are producing language correctly. However, I teach a lot of writing classes, and when I first started teaching them, I thought teaching a writing class was teaching writing. It didn't take very long for me to realize that the balance is between reading and writing, as that relationship is a symbiotic relationship. You really can't do one without the other. And why they're categorized as separate in some sense is a little, I don't know, it somehow doesn't seem right to me. And in addition to being a teacher, I've been doing a degree in applied linguistics with a focus on second language acquisition, or SLA. And in that domain of research, there's a huge emphasis on the role of input. And the input is what students, take, work into the mysterious corners of their brain and process into language and recognize patterns and forms of the language as part of that process of acquiring it. So reading is a form of input. Input is a part of language learning, and therefore it's important. And I teach in an academic context, and in academia and the university setting, students have a huge and substantial reading burden. And that's important to deal with. I mean, that can't be dismissed. And finally, you know, I looked this up before giving this presentation. And the most recent estimate I could find from a relatively reliable source is that the global adult literacy rate is approximately 86%. So, first of all, not everybody can read to begin with. So reading is important. Reading is important for language learning. Reading is important for being a student. Reading is important for being, a human being. So I know that people who are participating in this particular conference are probably very passionate about extensive reading and probably know all about it. So I'm not going to reiterate tenets of ER. I do want to just kind of contrast them as we approach this project or approach that I'm introducing. So when I think of intensive reading versus extensive reading, I think of intensive reading as being more difficult, right? I mean, one of the principles of ER is that it should be, kind of pleasurable, accessible reading, not putting a huge linguistic burden on the reader. And I think of ER as having lots of reading, whereas intensive reading tends to be rather limited in scope in terms of text length. So you would find books in ER, and you'd find, articles, essays, papers in intensive reading contexts. Typically, another way that people perceive an important factor in delineating these two ways of approaching reading is about student choice. And typically, more choice is supposed to be important in ER. And students have more autonomy in how they read and what they do with reading in the extensive reading context. And typically, given that they're supposed to choose their own books and pursue their own interests, they probably have more motivation. Although I did put varies for intensive reading, because I think that's somewhat, if you choose a book, you may be motivated to read it. If you're given a paper to read, an essay, an article, whatever, in some sense, it could be hard to say whether or not you have motivation. So I wrote varies. And I'm introducing this now because as I go through the approach I'm talking about in my own context, I'll bring this back, but see how it compares to what I'm proposing in this presentation. But I was looking back and thinking about extensive reading, and there's a quote from a text by Hedgecock and Ferris that's a description of extensive reading, but I think it applies to reading in general. So they wrote at the time, about a decade ago, rarely in language education do we find a teaching approach that is so universally hailed as beneficial, important, and necessary, truly an approach that has no detractors and many fervent advocates, yet is so underutilized and even ignored in curricula, course lesson design, and materials development. And they also characterize ER as an approach to teaching reading whose goal is to get students reading in the English language and enjoying it. So ER is based on the well-established principle that we learn to read by reading. Great. So this approach that I'm going to talk about that doesn't, meet the typical qualifications of ER, it's something that I would say all of that description hopes to meet that description in terms of being enjoyable, to get students to learn reading by reading. And I just find that in general, reading is underemphasized in many language learning curricula. Maybe that's a broad generalization. Maybe for someone watching this presentation, you'd say, no, actually, it's an emphasis in our context. And that probably is true in this conference. But nonetheless, I would go back to saying people often focus on grammatical form and productive language skills, or so-called productive language skills. Okay, so let me talk about my teaching context, just to give a little context. Well, give a little background information. So I teach in New York City in what's called the American Language Program at Columbia University. This is ESL, people learning English as a second language program. It's one of the oldest ones in the United States. And the students are typically a multicultural, diverse group of adult learners of, variety of differing linguistic backgrounds English abilities and academic goals. We have students who are working on degrees at Columbia. We have students who come here just for a semester. And we have a variety of students. However, I would point out that primarily our students are at higher levels of proficiency. In some sense, this may be a contrast with people teaching in EFL contexts that are attending this conference. But we see students at levels B1 to C1, CEFR levels. So I sense that, you know, C1 level language education, English language education is not necessarily so common, but Columbia as a university has very high demands for TOEFL scores. So we see students entering that way. Students who are proficient in the language, just, you know, highly proficient, yet nonetheless need a bit more work. Class size tends to be smaller, between 10 and 20 students. Well, probably never 20, but let's say up to 15. There's also programmatic diversity in our program. We do have an intensive English program, and that's taught through teams of 3 instructors. But we also have a variety of EAP courses. They tend to focus on academic writing for both undergrad and graduate students. And we have some more specific courses. For example, there's a legal English course. I write materials diversity here because instructors essentially have a great deal of latitude with what kind of materials they use for teaching. Some people prefer to use textbooks. Some people prefer to write their own materials. Some people prefer to use materials they wrote some time ago and have, you know, continued to edit and adjust. So there's a variety. It's one of the strengths, I would say, of the program, if you're a teacher. And there's a real emphasis on academic writing. I mean, this is the way that students are assessed and find their way to be promoted or to move on and up and out of the program itself. So again, part of my interest in reading comes from the fact that I have to do a lot of teaching of writing. Okay, so let me talk about this approach that I'm emphasizing in this talk. I guess I'm calling it a consolidated collaborative approach. Consolidated in this sense means combining principles of ER with principles of IR. So what I want to talk about is first of all, reading as a teacher, selecting books within this approach, starting books together as a class, reading individually, but then discussing in groups and as a class, a variety of supplementary tasks, and follow-up reading. So let's start with reading as a teacher. Teachers should be readers. I think that this is something that's emphasized throughout a variety of texts, whether texts about learning reading or excuse me, teaching reading, or texts about the role of reading in students' lives. I mean, if we are readers, we become models for students. We also have the opportunity to demonstrate the role of reading in our lives by simply talking about it, and so forth. I mean, I saw a presentation where someone was saying, you know, if you want to show students that reading is important, let them read in class. And I suspect that in this conference that some people are doing that. In any case, since I'm talking about selecting books, I think teachers should be readers because it helps you to keep up to date with books being published that may be accessible and interesting for students. Now, I use the modal verb can, and I put it in italics. I mean, teachers are also busy. It's not teachers' job to keep up with every book that's being published, but somehow, some way, if you really kind of embrace using relatively recent kind of nonfiction books, you can kind of figure out, you can keep your ear to the ground, as the idiom goes, and think, oh, that's being published, or I read a review of that. That sounds like something students would like. Oh, it's, you know, about 250 pages. Let me look at the language. Yep, that's probably accessible for students at this level, et cetera. So for me, this becomes a habit. I do this by, kind of creating an informal database of text, just, a note, a file that might be exploitable for classroom purposes. I love to read myself, but I'm always thinking, is this something that would be accessible to students? And if it's accessible to students, then it has potential as classroom language learning materials. It should be clear at this point, but these steps really help for selecting books for students. So let's talk about the actual selecting of books. I think the first principle here is that books should be linguistically appropriate. That seems clear. There's probably a lot of ways to determine that. One would probably be just an informal, highly subjective judgment that something is appropriate. But just to be a little bit more specific, what do I do is I try to find, if there's a book I'm interested in, well, first you probably should read it, but I mean, if you're going to use it in the classroom, you probably should read it. But I try to find a sample of the text from the book. So sometimes publishers' pages will have a little bit of text, like an introduction or a chapter. Sometimes Amazon.com, in the description of the text, I don't mean the preview that you can see, but in their description, they often include maybe a chapter. So if you can find, or if you get the ebook and you're able to copy some of the text, I use a tool like Complete Lexical Tutor, and I use some of the vocabulary profiler tools that are available there. And those can tell you about, for a passage of text, I mean, this is a whole other presentation, but for a passage of text, it can say, these words are in the first 1,000 words of English in this corpus. These words are in the 2,000 range. And as you become more familiar with that, you would know that, if you start getting words in certain ranges, it's probably going to be challenging to read for students without some kind of support. But if you're if you know the level of the students, and we'll talk about that in a second, and you can match it, it can work out nicely. Another tool is Lexile Analyzer. That one you have to sign up to access, but it tells you through its not entirely explained tools about the syntactic complexity of a text. And I think one thing that it does is it essentially is measuring how much subordination there is in the sentences in a text. As if you were speaking and you were using lots of relative and subordinate clauses, it would require more more cognitive horsepower. I mean, more memory, active memory, working memory to understand what's being said. And I suppose something similar applies to written text. So I think that's part of what it's doing. But schools in the United States use this because I believe, there are formal guidelines for if you're in this grade in public education in the United States, then you can work with texts of these Lexile ranges, Lexile measurements, I believe they're called. And sometimes on Amazon.com, you'll see these numbers. Sometimes in various book sources, they'll tell you what the Lexile measure is of a text. And that can be useful to know too, but both of these require having a sense of how these things relate to the students and the levels that you're teaching. So I know that Paul Nation is speaking at this conference, and I think he's emphasized numerous times that there's very little you can do with vocabulary teaching if you don't understand, to some extent, how many words your students already know. That's like a starting point for vocabulary instruction and kind of all forms of instruction. So I write here, assess students' vocabulary knowledge to roughly understand levels of vocabulary knowledge on the part of students, because as we know, knowing a word is a multifaceted, complex concept. It's not one thing. And what I do is I establish kind of correlations. I mean, they're not, formal, between student levels in the program that I teach in, because there are multiple ones. And levels of vocabulary knowledge. So I could say to myself, students at this level tend to know vocabulary at CEFR level B2. And over time, if I keep track of that, if I, for example, assess students when they enter a course, assess students on the way out using those vocabulary size test, and also kind of keep track of that for the book and the level. And over time, I can start to say, students in level 7, which is the level in our program, can handle vocabulary in the B2 range. So that's an ongoing project to get a sense of that. And then books should be epistemically appropriate. And, don't ask students to read about things they don't completely know about. I mean, reading about something they don't know about is good. It's an opportunity for learning, but there are limits to what we know about. And that could prove, we want to find the balance, right? So much like communication tasks require knowing your audience, in this case, you should know your students. So what's probabilistically appropriate for them? You have to make that judgment. You obviously don't know what they know, but so I'm teaching in a university. Most of the students are of university age. I find that works by academics written for a general audience have a scholarly basis, but are linguistically and epistemically appropriate for students in this context. And that has become kind of my sweet spot for books I use for this kind of project. So let me give you an example. There's a professor of psychology at the University of Maryland named Michelle Gelfand. So I looked on Google Scholar. Her most cited piece of research is called Converging Measurement of Horizontal and Vertical Individualism and Collectivism. When you see words like individualism and collectivism, you probably know it's something about cultural psychology, anthropology, etc. I'm not going to ask students to read that journal article. For language learning purposes, it's probably a bit too academic, among other reasons. But she published a book kind of summarizing her research called Rule Makers, Rule Breakers, How Tight and Loose Cultures Wire the World. Completely accessible, written for a general audience, and good in this context. So kind of academic-y, kind of using academic language, but not overtly challenging to engage with. Another one, there's the surgeon. I mean, I think he's better known as a writer, frankly, but there's the, let's say, surgeon and professor of health, Atul Gawande at Harvard University. Again, he's got lots of research, but a surgical safety checklist to reduce morbidity and mortality in the global population. And then, it turned into a book called The Checklist Manifesto, How to Get Things Right. And so again, there's the text that you can grapple with as students, And another issue is just preparing students for university levels reading expectations. Another quote from the Hedgecock and Ferris text: many L1 undergraduates are at least initially taken aback by the amount of the reading assigned to them in college. When a student reads even non-academic text extensively, the experience can produce a carryover effect to more intensive assigned reading. So again, they're writing specifically about extensive reading, but you can see there's a relationship with, I'm hoping that there's a carryover, a form of, let's say, transfer of reading slightly, kind of pop academic texts to not only strengthen their reading skills, but help them along the path into their university programs. Another principle is that books should provide opportunities for learning and might be implicitly instructive in ways students can benefit from. Okay, this is the content learning part. So exploit text for their learning and transfer opportunities. For example, that book, Rule Makers, Rule Breakers, provides, it's just a thought-provoking understanding of different cultures and cultural norms. Often, if I'm teaching in, many students, frequently they've, let's say pre-pandemic, were people who were arriving in New York City a week or two before the course started, sometimes less. And all of a sudden they were in an unfamiliar environment with people engaging in unfamiliar behaviors, things that would be violating social norms in the places they come from. And this book was a really good framework for understanding, why why place people act differently in different places. And also in a multicultural intensive course where we could have possibly 15 students with 15 different passports, people are going to behave differently in the classroom, but this is a good way to get people going in a way that's productive and, excuse me, productive in terms of their interactions with their peers. So the Checklist Manifesto makes the case for the value of checklists. So for students learning essay writing, general writing skills, how to give a presentation, all these things, after reading the book, I could ask them, okay, make a checklist for this kind of task that you're doing. What are the steps that you know that you need to take? Or if students are writing essays and it's a writing intensive course and they're making particular mistakes they've received feedback on, they could write in their checklist, review subject-verb agreement in my sentences, review punctuation use, because they know that that's their area. So, the content of the book can transfer to the skill of being a successful student, in addition to providing the reading practice. Some other texts that I have found to be productive that I've used in this way, Factfulness by Hans Rosling. Forgive me. And Factfulness is about global issues, thinking globally, understanding and discussing statistics, thinking critically. Grit by Angela Duckworth. It's a kind of motivational text, but the notion of grit and developing a growth mindset actually is highly relevant to learning a second language as an adult. So I think that can be a good text. Palaces for the People. This is thinking about the built environment around us and how it affects societies, things like libraries, parks, shelters, whatever it may be. Probably relevant in unanticipated ways in relation to the pandemic, so I may revisit that one. Oops. The Years That Matter Most is about inequality and the meritocracy and higher education in the United States. That one is probably a little culturally specific, but useful for students studying at a university in the United States. So let's talk about the next step, and that's starting books together as a class. I came across this quote from William Grabe. Teachers commonly think that they do not have a major role to play in student motivation for reading. This view could not be further from the truth. And there's a specific way, straightforward, nothing too sophisticated, but it helps. So I say build motivation by starting a book together with students. You could do preview and prediction tasks of the book. Teacher can read the book aloud to the students, the preface, the introduction, perhaps a first chapter, something like that. To me, everybody's focused on the text when you're reading aloud. It's a great way to start things off. I really recommend that step as being a source of strength. You could establish the relationship between the book and real world events, student interests, student goals, whatever it may be, whatever it is to get students interested, because these steps seem to be a more effective approach to starting than simply saying, start reading this book at home. I didn't write it here, but examining the cover, by looking at the cover, what do you expect? Who's the writer? What do they, what does it say in their biography and their author information? All these kinds of things. I can't absolutely say it builds motivation, but I find that it builds a strong starting point for reading and getting involved with the text. So you could have, after doing that first reading aloud, you could have discussion questions on the text that first confirm comprehension, and then secondly, encourage students to respond with opinion, reaction, and other examples of critical thinking skills. So first we make sure they understand it, then we want to have them engage with it, because I think that's very meaningful. And I think it just makes the interest and motivation there and real. And then the next principle of this approach is to foster collaboration and interaction. So what I typically do is divide the book into a reading schedule. You know, in my context, depending on the class, I probably see the students 2 or 3 times a week for a few hours each time. Sometimes if I'm teaching with other teachers, we could divide the book, or it can be easier just to have one person doing the book with the students. You know, it really depends on how often you're seeing students and how much you want to devote to this project. But I find that there's a limit to how long students want to engage with a book. I feel that way myself when reading some books. Even if I'm interested, I could be ready to move on. So I'd say 2 to 3 weeks probably can be good. And then what I have the students do is I assign them into groups or pairs and have them that they become responsible for a class discussion on different parts of the book. So that could mean, you know, student A and B are leading that discussion on chapter 2 in a few days. That means they need to read it individually. Everybody in the class needs to read it. Those 2 students need to communicate with each other, to come up with questions that they want to ask the class and to lead a discussion. And so I emphasize, you know, okay, using comprehension questions is okay. Probably better to have questions that ask for students to give their opinion, make connections to their own lives, et cetera, because that's when I find students are most engaged. If the question is like, you know, which people were discussed in chapter 2, you know, people don't get so excited about that kind of thing. A good strategy can also be to ask the students to submit the questions to you in advance to make sure that they're clear in meaning and perhaps appropriate. This is something to consider. I can't remember which book it was. Maybe it was the Tight and Loose one, Michelle Gelfand, and it talked about something that was culturally, let's say, inappropriate somewhere or appropriate, and something that potentially is controversial or taboo. And then they ask students in the discussion, they asked the class, like, you know, do you think this is appropriate or taboo? But it was something maybe that people didn't necessarily want to talk about in a group setting. And, you know, these things happen, but might be worth checking the questions in advance. So in each class, some students are leading the discussion while others are participating in it. Everyone's engaged. And the teacher's role is to provide cultural and linguistic support, as well as recognize opportunity for focus on forms instruction. So this is where you can do perhaps error correction, take notes on what people are saying. You could notice linguistic patterns and take notes on that to provide feedback on. In a sense, this is like a backdoor opportunity to more intensive reading activities, because you can kind of judge, are people reading this carefully enough to understand it? Principle 6, exploit opportunities to complement the text's content. I know it's during a pandemic, so you know, maybe this works, maybe it doesn't, at least for the short term, hopefully. So one thing that I've done is go on field trips. For example, so this is 2019 fall, autumn, right before the pandemic hit New York. But for the students, they visited shelters, libraries, parks, and other forms of social infrastructure in New York City and gave follow-up presentations on what they found. You know, one of the nice, you know, benefits of teaching in New York City is that we have the city there to explore and, you know, quote unquote, use. I know that that's not going to be the case everywhere, but, you know, look to the internet. As we know, there's lots of resources. Another possibility is to engage with authors. You could invite authors to answer students' questions on Zoom or by email for a richer engagement with the text. That can happen. For example, for the book called The Years That Matter Most, the book that they read was, let's see, published in August. I read it in August. I said, this is good for these students at this level. And then the person was doing, the course started in September, and the author was doing like a book tour in maybe October. So I ended up kind of designing the curriculum so we could read the book and then go to the live Q&A. And that was, you know, the students could ask questions, and it worked out well. That's, you know, roll of the dice and good fortune. It's not always going to work out that way, but it's an idea. And of course, exploit linguistic and communication opportunities. Students can write about the book, a review. the topic. You could do a research paper, you could incorporate the book as a source, you could learn more about the topic, whatever it can be. Students could also do kind of diary writings reflecting on the experience of reading the book. And students can give presentations on topics addressed in the book. And certainly exploit opportunities to make connections with students' cultures, where they come from. I mean, that's really interesting, and it's organic to do so. And then use this reading experience as a starting point for more reading. I don't think anyone would disagree in this conference that we want students to be reading more often. So what I do is, for the next round of reading, have students choose a book from a selection of books and then read them in groups. This was an idea kind of that some colleagues in my program do when I started in the program, and they call it book groups. The way that I use it as the class read first, the book group second, because I find that the successful class reading can give students the tools for how they approach the book group reading after. And so in that situation, they work in groups to read the entire text and meet and discuss it every week in class, and then ultimately kind of report on it at the end of the reading to the class. The class read, meaning the reading that we did together previous to this step, demonstrates for strategies for engaging with the text. So this group reading activity should mimic those strategies, but be more independent. So in some sense, it's going a little bit more in the ER direction. So these are kind of 7 principles to this approach. So they should be books should be linguistically appropriate. Books should be epistemically appropriate. Books should provide opportunities for learning and developing knowledge. Books should build motivation by, teachers should build motivation by starting a book together with students. Teachers should foster collaboration and interaction. Teachers should exploit opportunities to complement the text's content. And teachers should exploit linguistic and communication opportunities. Oh, we'll make it 8 principles, and use reading to do more reading. So here's that chart again. And so when we compare intensive reading to extensive reading, I would say that this approach varies in difficulty. I've definitely had students tell me I've never read a complete book before, or I've never read a book that wasn't a novel, for instance. So this kind of, genre is not quite the right word, but these kinds of nonfiction books may be just less familiar with the students, but they're closer to they may be closer to the kinds of reading that they will do as undergraduate or graduates, depending on their area of study. In terms of quantity, well, it's an entire book, so there's more in terms of quantity than there would be in intensive reading. Choice, it varies. I mean, I like to choose the first book myself. At the same time, sometimes I give the students a choice. If I have materials and a structure to working with 2 or 3, I could have them choose it. But I find for the first one, maybe it's can be more effective to choose oneself. Autonomy varies. I mean, again, I'm choosing the book, so that's a lack of autonomy for students. But again, how they lead those discussions and how much reading they do is up to them. And I mentioned how much reading because one of the risks of going too long with this project is that very engaged or motivated students will say, like halfway through, like, oh, I already finished the book. I don't know if that's a problem, but I don't want to stop someone from being interested in reading, but it's something to consider. And motivation will vary. I mean, some of the feedback I got on one of the books was critical of the book. So I was happy. I mean, happy in the sense that, great, you can engage with this and offer your opinion. And secondly, it's good that they were willing to be honest about it in a sense. One of the criticisms of the book called The Checklist Manifesto was that it was repetitive in terms of making the same point repeatedly. But I thought that's great. I mean, that's like review of the content for second language learners. That's not a bad thing. In any case, so I just want to share a little bit of student feedback. First of all, in terms of content, a question I asked some students was, would you recommend this book or a translation of it to the average citizen in your country? I have a few quotes regarding the book called Palaces for the People. Somebody said, I would definitely recommend reading this book to people related to urban development in my country. In large cities, we have reconstruction, and if we want it to be effective, they need to take into account modern trends and modern needs of citizens so that the city was friendly to them. This issue is particularly important for cities in Russia that are not the largest cities in the Federation or capitals. I think this book could be an effective source for solving urgent social problems. Another student, I would recommend this book to the average citizen in Korea. As I mentioned above, the idea of social infrastructure is not familiar with the Korean citizen, and thus Korean people seem not to consider what the social infrastructure should be. Sometimes Korean people seem to cast a vote for politicians who make void promises, such as building an airport or a bridge that will never be used by anyone. I think, as same as Korean policymakers, it would be better for the Korean people to read this book and learn about the idea. And then a slight critique. I don't strongly recommend this book to the average Japanese citizens. While the book introduces an interesting thoughts and facts, the author only keeps arguing one same thing. We should strengthen our social infrastructure. Long case studies are compelling, but could become obstacles for ordinary people to continue reading. I do think the concept of social infrastructure is worth spreading among Japanese people in general, but I would rather choose to introduce the basic summary of the book. Again, I see this as a kind of secretly a good thing, because if the author is reiterating one concept repeatedly, it's going to help people who aren't completely proficient in reading the language to understand it. But this is a fair critique. And then I also have feedback on what they said about the reading process. So again, I'm just choosing some random students. I think it's the same. Yeah, it's the same book. And I'm not, as you can see, I'm not editing the comments in any sense, except for here where there's an ellipses, because it was too long. So reading this book would be valuable to English learners for two reasons: vocabulary building and cultural study of American society. Cultural knowledge is sometimes necessary to understand the context. Therefore, it is as important as learning the language itself. Thought-provoking. I would definitely recommend this book for English language learners. Simply, this book has variety of language structure and cultural background. Palaces for the People not only discusses what achievements society may gain by fostering the new concept, but also exposes some aspects of Americans' culture, such as brief examples of segregation and Americans' view of politics and policy. Furthermore, the book is a practical language tool. Learners are more likely to learn very useful, sophisticated vocabulary and absorb some advanced grammatical structures, such as reduced unreal conditional form and negative inversions. And one last one, because I like the enthusiasm. Yes, definitely yes. The language and expression used in the book were easy and straight so that the English learners could understand it clearly and easily. What's more, there was a lot of native people situation, which provides students a chance to observe Americans' daily life and social infrastructures. I assert that understanding culture is a vital step in learning a foreign language. That's a topic for a whole other conference, that last sentence. So you can see, I mean, I have lots of these, and I think it's, helpful to you if you choose to use a book to definitely take down this kind of feedback. And another thing you could do is to have students write a letter to future readers of the book and to say why they should read the book or what's valuable. They could even take these kind of questions, the notes, their answers, synthesize them, write it as a letter. And then when you introduce that book in a future course, you could start by having students read the letter, which may provide some implicit motivation. I pulled just a couple quotes in this text, a couple quotes from text in this presentation. One is from William Grabe, who probably has presented at this conference before. Reading in a Second Language, Moving from Theory to Practice, great book. And also Hedgecock and Ferris, and as well as the literacy information from the World Bank. So this presentation is called Using Nonfiction Books to Facilitate L2 English Acquisition, Peer Collaboration, and Content Learning. Normally, I would have put my email address here in case people wanted to communicate and ask follow-up questions. but I was reading how these presentations are put on YouTube, and I wasn't sure of the merits of including my email address in that situation. So I believe there's a kind of Discord, that Discord is going to be used to facilitate Q&A, as I'm not doing this live because of time zone challenges. Or if you were to look me up at Columbia, you'd be able to find my email address, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. I'm love to take suggestions or recommendations for books, or if you have any critiques or whatever it may be, I'm happy to hear that as well. So thank you for the time. Thank you for your time, and thank you for the conference. Okay, thanks.